Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.
Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Ray. So good to have you. You might can tell I've got a little bit of a head cold allergy thing going on here, so I'm not going to talk a lot. We have Professor Paul Sullivan on again today. Last time he was very, he's just so knowledgeable. And today we talk about Japan and the Middle East and all kinds of stuff. I hope you enjoy it. I won't be here on the post because I sound like this, so you will hear me and Professor Sullivan talk, and then we will cut to our standard outro. And without further ado, here's my interview with Professor Sullivan. Well, Professor Sullivan, it's great to have you on again. How are you doing today?
Oh, doing well. How about you?
Oh, I can't complain, other than the allergies we were just talking about. Other than that, doing good. So today we're going to shift a little bit. We talked last time about the Middle East, and today we're going to get into Japan. 127 million people, I think, is what it is on that small island of Japan. And so, there's a lot that goes on there, but from an energy perspective, it doesn't really get brought into the national spotlight very often. Why do you think that is, and what are we missing?
Well, Japan is one of the least energy self-sufficient countries on the planet. It has only about 6% of its energy resources coming from inside the country, and the rest is imported into the country. So they're very much reliant on importing oil up to the high 80s, sometimes low 80% from the Middle East, and also natural gas about 60% plus from the Middle East. So they're very much reliant on somewhat unstable areas. They also rely on places like Malaysia, Australia, Indonesia for coal, and they really have no real indigenous resources for energy and really never have that they've used fully, even though they become a developed and rich country. It's amazing how they pulled this off. And if we go back in time, their overseas energy reliance actually was one of the causes belli of the attack on Pearl Harbor and us getting into the Pacific War, because they didn't have oil for their jets and naval ships, and we decided to cut them off.
Yeah, it would seem now that, 2017, that to be as populated as Japan is and with such a little bit of natural resources on the island there, that almost as far as foreign affairs go, that they have to be pretty neutral because they're so dependent on the rest of the world.
Well, they're very, very clever in their foreign affairs, foreign diplomacy, and foreign energy policy. They tread very carefully in the Middle East. They were importing from Iran during the time of sanctions. They were allowed to do that. At the same time, they were importing from the UAE and Saudi Arabia, Oman, and many others. And with regard to natural gas, they're pretty much silent on the Qatar issue right now. They don't want to step into that one. They don't need the trouble of being cut off. And also, they tread rather lightly in Southeast Asia because they rely on Southeast Asian countries like Malaysia and Indonesia, and then the Asia-Pacific country, the most important, Australia. So they're trying to make friends pretty much. And, of course, that's difficult in this complex world.
Right. And so how does that affect U.S. and Japanese relations, especially when U.S., from an energy standpoint, might want to put sanctions or use its energy leverage against foreign entities, and Japan really can't back us up? As you mentioned, they were buying oil from Iran during the sanctions. Well,
we actually allow them to do that because there's some distance sanctions regimes. Other countries were able to import from Iran during that as well. Japan, its number one ally. That's a very large leap since the Great Pacific War, what they call it, in World War II, what we call it, when we were bitter enemies. They do really very much rely on us, and they're hoping to get natural gas, LNG, and oil from us in the future. We've been sending LNG to them since the 1960s from Alaska, but now with all this new natural gas coming out of the ground from fracking and so forth, and also the change of the 1973 law allowing us to export oil, the Japanese are very much interested in getting more of our oil and gas. They're actually investing in our oil and gas to have first dibs.
Okay, and so one of the things that I'm curious about here is if you go back through even this last decade here recently, Japan has the nuclear meltdown with Fukushima, and how they responded to that, because as you mentioned here, I'm just trying to put this picture together and understand, well, they don't have a lot of resources. A nuclear power plant melting down would seem to be catastrophic, obviously from environmental standpoints, but just from a power standpoint.
Well, from a power standpoint, nuclear power for Japan before the triple disaster of March 11, 2011, was 30%. That's 30% of all their electricity was made by nuclear power. And those shut down rapidly after the event. So they lost 30% of their electrical power. And it's even worse than that. If you're thinking of a normal electrical system where everyone's interconnected and trading goes across zones, that wasn't happening in Japan. Japan is actually separated into two zones of 50 hertz and 60 hertz. And where the problem happened was in the 50 hertz area, and the electricity from the 60 hertz area could not get to the 50 hertz area to make up for any of the losses. So they were pretty much stuck. And also back then there were 10 major electricity, pretty much regional monopolies who barely dealt with each other, and trading across the prefectures or their trading zones was almost non-existent. This is kind of an old boys network that made the situation much worse.
So you mentioned that 30% of their power came from nuclear, and if I understand what you're saying correctly, they shut down all the nuclear power plants after Fukushima, is that correct?
Yes, very quickly afterwards. They shut them all down, and right now there are only, I think, 3 that have restarted. So they're relying a great deal on LNG, natural gas-powered electricity, and coal, not so much oil. What happened after the event, it wasn't just the nuclear plant that was damaged. There was also transmission lines. Some of the gas power stations and coal stations were also damaged. Some of the transformer stations were damaged. It was a very difficult time, and they had to almost immediately increase their imports of LNG and coal, which given that just for once in a while either number 1 or number 2 in coal imports, that was a big shock to the world coal and LNG markets. You take a look at the prices right after that event, they skyrocketed. And Japan LNG got up to about $16+ per MMBTU, whereas in this country it was down at about 4 or 5. And coal prices just went through the roof when this happened as well. But also what was happening in China added to those coal prices. Another curious thing about this is the Japanese had a bunch of gas and coal plants in mothballs. It was very clever. They almost had a sense something was going to happen. And soon after the nuclear plants were shut down, these mothballed plants, which actually had people working in them to keep them operable, restarted. Part of what saved the country.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was about to ask you, is if you lose 30% of your power, how do you suddenly just replace that without massive blackouts? It sounds like, if I understand, they kind of had a backup strategy in place already.
Yeah, but they had some excess capacity, but the deal was following. It was a big cultural deal. The Japanese government asked the Japanese people to cut back on the use of electricity by 15% in whatever way they can. And the Japanese actually cut back more than 15%. They were shutting the lights off. They were not using AC much. They allowed, and in Japan, if you're an office worker, a male office worker, even if it's a small office, you wear a dark suit, a tie, and you're very formal. After this, they were allowed to wear cool wear in the warmer months. What happened was in March, it starts to warm up in Japan. It can still remain rather cool in certain places, but in places like Tokyo, soon after this event, you're heading into the summer. So they had to control air conditioner use, which is very large in Japan in the warmer months, lighting, and also, oddly enough, the Japanese electric toilets use about 1% to 2% of the electricity in the country. So I guess a social change had to happen there as well. The Japanese are a very much unified and resilient society. I can think of no other that would have reacted to an event like this the way they did. Think of the following. They lost almost 20,000 people. The country was devastated in a good section of its east coast. They lost their atomic power plants. There was a huge amount of other damage, including to ports and to other infrastructure. And yet they went immediately to work. But that's not to say that it was perfect, because part of the problem that allowed this to happen was an old boys network, where you had people who ran some of these 10 large electricity companies actually doing a revolving door routine with their nuclear regulatory agency. That Nuclear Regulatory Agency does not exist anymore, and it's been reformed. And the issue I told you about, the 10 monopolies and the different parts and all of that, the Japanese are working very hard to solve that issue. They've been changing their electricity market structure, and they've been changing some of the leadership in their regulatory agencies.
I want to get back to foreign affairs in just a second, but first, I'm just curious about their grid. One of the things you see in the U.S. and in a lot of countries is they have an aging infrastructure for the electric grid. How is their grid as far as, is it old? Is it outdated? Does it need to be updated? Where does it kind of fit in?
It's old in many places. They're looking to modernize it and actually start microgrids and smart grids, but of course it's very expensive. Most of their nuclear plants are well over 40 years old, which explains why a lot of these nuclear plants will probably not be restarted. Because after 40 years, you can extend it to maybe 60 years, and then you have to pretty much shut it down. What also had to be done, and this isn't about the age of the grid or the infrastructure, the Japanese government ordered all of the nuclear plants to beef up their security measures against tsunami waves and earthquakes, and many of these companies have been spending billions of dollars a year since 2011 to build these huge tsunami walls, and also to make the plants almost like submarine waterproof, have excess water sources up on top of hills. Because what happened with Fukushima was when the earthquake happened, the plant shut down. That's normal. But what happened after that was abnormal. A 45-foot tsunami wave crashed over their 15-foot tsunami walls and went roaring through the entire plant, crashed their generating station that was used to send cooling water into the plant, and hence you had a meltdown because the cooling system stopped.
Just for perspective, how often do you said it was unusual, so how unusual is it for that tsunami to follow up at that height?
It's been centuries since something like that has happened.
So it's one of those deals where you can set a standard and you plan that standard, but then you kind of have the anomaly that comes out and just wrecks the whole system, if you will.
Right, it's like the 100-year storm in New York with Superstorm Sandy. But there was a very interesting stone sign that was written in ancient Japanese up on the hill just above Fukushima, and I think in Iwate Prefecture, not far from the plant, which came up out of the mud and all this because of the tsunami. And what it said was, do not build closer than this to the ocean. Because they went through this many, many years ago. And if you look at some of the iconic paintings out of Japan, you see one of a huge tsunami. Tsunamis are not unusual in Japan, and Japan is heavily seismic. Actually, there is an earthquake that pretty much everyone knows is going to happen, which is right off an area near the Hamaoka nuclear plant. And they built a 150-foot wall for the tsunami. But it's a fault line that goes along the ocean just off of the shorelines of Japan, near that prefecture, Chubu area and so forth, and it's going to be massive. Pretty much everyone is sure that it's going to be about a 9. No one is sure when this is going to happen. That's the thing about earthquakes. It's not like the weather. You can't say, today you're going to have a 7 earthquake or a 9 earthquake. You never know. You can get indications from geological testing and aftershocks and all of this stuff, but you never can tell. And Japan is very much a modern society with lots of electrical stuff and relies a lot on electricity. And they're thinking about this earthquake to come in the future, and they're going to have to put a lot of money and thought into how to protect against it or figure out a way to recover from it.
Okay, so I want to transition a little bit into foreign affairs. Help us understand a couple of things. First, let's start off with the near nations. So you have, obviously, China, South Korea, and North Korea, who are right there by Japan. And China has been stockpiling oil for quite a few years now. What is their relationship with China? Because North Korea seems to be kind of the one who causes a lot of friction in that area between those nations.
Well, Chinese-Japanese relations are not particularly good, and that goes back to World War II and even before that. A lot to do with history and how the Japanese treated the Chinese in Manchuria in earlier years, and the brutalities of World War II were on both sides. with regard to South Korea, the South Koreans and the Japanese have very difficult relations at times because of what happened when South Korea was part of the Japanese colonial system and also during World War II. But all of this is pretty much water under the bridge, except for the people who think of this historical animosity and the reasons behind it. And I think it's very important, certainly, for South Korea and Japan to get together. They're two allies of ours, but it's very difficult for us to get the two together sometimes because of these difficulties between them that go back really centuries. And China is the big man on campus in East Asia, and they're messing about in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. They're sending their warships right between Japanese islands. They're having overflights. They're pushing out their security zones. The Chinese are being very aggressive, and the Japanese look to us as their possible backers. And we are backers because we have tens of thousands of troops in Japan and tens of thousands of troops in South Korea. And we obviously are not in the best relations with China right now. With regard to North Korea shot missiles right into the Sea of Japan, heading at Japan. Now that would make the country rather nervous. The Chinese are starting to buckle down on the North Koreans for the first time ever, really buckle down. But the Chinese viewpoint on North Korea is keep the South and the North separated in order to help us and give us a strategic balance, or rather imbalance, in the region. But the rather new, not entirely new, North Korean leadership is problematic even for China right now, definitely for Japan. Japan wants to build up its military. It has limitations to build up its military because MacArthur, that is General MacArthur of the U.S. Army, actually wrote the constitution that Japan has right now. And it kept their defense budget to 1% of their GDP.
I don't think a lot of people realize, General MacArthur, what kind of impact he had on Japan after the end of World War II for a long period of time.
Oh, it was huge. He was a bit of an arrogant fellow, but he got the job done from his perspective. And it started to, under his efforts, pacify the situation, although things were still happening on the ground. He was involved in war crimes trials against the emperor and others and somehow smoothed that over with the help of other American experts in the military. But he actually started the rebuilding of Japan. But the rebuilding of Japan after World War II was pretty much done by the Japanese. I'm sure if MacArthur were around right now, he would take credit for it and take a breath on his corncob pipe and move his army hat to the side. But the Japanese did this, and it had a lot to do with energy as well. When they got out of World War II, you could not find a factory with a roof on it. The place was devastated. The people were starving. The farms were destroyed. The infrastructure was ruined. And look at them now. And they built that mostly on energy from the small amount of coal they had and hydropower. After the 60s and the 70s, they really started to import oil mostly from the Middle East. But our relationship with Japan has remained close along the years. And it's rather odd. I look in my driveway and I see a Japanese car and a German car.
Right.
Never would have thought of that, or my parents never would have thought of that in the 1930s and 40s. Gives us hope.
No, that's right.
The Germans and the Japanese are now close allies of ours.
That's right. Well, let's turn to some folks who aren't allies of us right now, at least unanimously, and that is the Middle East. And last time you came on, you kind of helped us understand what was going on in the Middle East from the standpoint of Turkey and what's going on there. Kind of reset the table for us with Japan and how they play a role in the Middle East, and what are some of their fears and concerns, and what would they like to see happen in the Middle East, and how does that work out with U.S. foreign policy?
Well, the Japanese and us obviously have some differences in the Middle East. They were very much not for the Iraq War, although they did help out with medical teams and peacekeepers. They try to stay out of the military side, combat side of things. They still have good relations, in quotes, with the Iranians, with the Saudis, with the Egyptians. They're big trading partners. and actually are involved in construction and other things in the Middle East. I think the Japanese want to have a soft imprint. They want to be the quiet ones in the region. They're doing that quite well. They do not have a military like we have, and my sense is that that's probably a good thing given some of the history. But I think the society has changed since then. They are no longer imperialistic as they once were. Actually, they took over most of Southeast Asia and attacked Australia in order to get resources. Resource wars in the history of Japan were rather common. Now, the United States and Japan, I'm sure, have regular conversations about the Middle East. What their greatest concern about the Middle East is access and reliability of resources. They want to make sure that Strait of Hormuz is open, that they're able to get all the oil and gas that they need from the Middle East. But also they look at the Middle East as a market, but not like China. Japan used to have a larger relative market in the Middle East, but the Chinese have just toasted everyone over there. Even some of the souvenirs in the shops in Egypt are made in China. I found that out trying to get a souvenir, turned it over, made in China, made in China, made in China. Every Middle East country has, except for Tunisia, Morocco, and Algeria, China as its biggest trading partner, not the U.S. anymore.
Okay, and I want to ask you about Iran, because one of the things that strikes me as curious is I have a friend from another nation. I'm not going to bring his name up here, but he went to Iran, and he said that, their nation in Iran, they get along really well, and that the U.S. has kind of made Iran look a little bit worse than what they actually are. So what are your thoughts on Iran? You obviously know this area very well. Are they kind of hyped up a little bit, or are they the big bad villain that maybe we've been led to believe?
Well, they are not the best of our friends. This goes back to actually 1952-53, when we were involved with a coup that replaced one of their leaders, Mossadegh, with the Shah. MI6 was involved, the British. And going fast forward into this business, they still resent us, by the way, for this, because they think that we interfered in their democratically elected prime minister, Mr. Mossadegh. Getting to 78, 79, the Iranian Revolution occurs. They call us the Great Satan almost off the bat. Khomeini did that off the bat. Then they get into a war with Iraq. Actually, Iraq invaded Iran, and that went on for 10 years. Almost 1 million people were casualties, and the border didn't change 1 millimeter, and it disrupted the oil markets. During that war, some of our naval ships and oil tankers were missiled by either side. Now, but the real difficulties didn't necessarily come from the revolution, but also the holding of the hostages. People in about my age, in 50s, and down listening to this right now, if I said 444 to you, what would you think immediately? Not the number 444. You would think of the 444 days that our hostages were kept in Iran. I know a couple of those hostages. Their lives were ruined. Our embassy was destroyed, and we've had no embassy since then. Then there was the bombing of the disco in Berlin, the bombing of the Marine barracks in the 1980s in Lebanon that they were connected with. And then there is the messing about in Saudi Arabia in the oil field, the messing about in Bahrain, right near the Fifth Fleet, the messing about in Lebanon and the development of Hezbollah and the funding of Hezbollah. Iran is involved with Hamas. Iran is also supporting the opposite of the people in Syria that we're supporting. Yeah, the Iranians are problematic. I could go on and on and on with this thing, but it's a real problem.
Well, no, that's kind of helpful. I've always been curious since he said that, and again, I'm not going to bring up who it was, but it was an interesting perspective, and I thought, well, I'd love to hear a foreign policy expert like yourself kind of break that down for us. Well, we are recording this in the middle of June, and obviously there's a lot of going on in the Middle East. We'd love to have you come on maybe late July-ish and talk to us about what's kind of transpired in the time since we had this talk about Japan. We talked about the Middle East last time, and where are things heading? Because as you talked about last time, and it's interesting to see with this dynamic with Japan here. I never really realized how their foreign policy is affected by their lack of ability to have sustainable energy by themselves. So we'd love to get you on maybe late July and talk about what's happened since we've talked here mid-June, and look forward to hearing what's going on then.
Well, that's interesting. Also, the Chinese, the South Koreans, the Taiwanese, and the Indians also have to tread rather carefully in the Middle East because of their reliance. Maybe we could chat about that the next time as well.
Absolutely, would love to do it, and I love having you on. You're so knowledgeable, and it's just good to soak up all this knowledge. So thank you so much for coming on, and we'll talk to you here soon.
Okay, thank you. And I like educating the folks, so that's one of the main reasons I'm doing this.
Well, we appreciate
Education is key.
That's right.
All right.
The Global Energy Leaders Podcast is produced by Michael Sims and Chris Prine. Chris Prine also serves as editor for the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. Until next time, keep climbing.
Thanks for listening to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.